There we go. All righty then. Okay. Welcome. This and that. Uh, for November. Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, chapter 7. We're just rolling right along. I decided that even though I did it before, I should do it again simply because I've now progressed through all prior 6 chapters. So that should put us in a more interesting place, I hope, in terms of the material. So, Theory of Rent, notebooks 10 to 12, pages 445 to 636 from June to August of 1862, the MECW 31, pages 250 to 578. It is no longer a question of explaining how it comes about that the price of a commodity yields rent as well as profit, thus apparently evading the general law of value. And by raising its price above its intrinsic surplus value, carrying more than the general rate of profit for a given capital. Now, the question is why, in the process of equalization of commodities at average prices, this particular commodity does not have to pass on to other commodities so much of its intrinsic surplus value that it only yields the average profit, but is able to realize a portion of its own surplus value, which forms an excess over and above average profit. So that it is possible for a farmer, the private ownership of land, mines, water, etc., by certain people, which enables them to snatch, intercept, and seize the excess surplus value over above profit, that is average profit, the rate of profit determined by the general rate of profit. Close quote. First of all, we will comment on why Marx was interested in the subject of rent. It's precisely a matter of explaining a phenomenon on the superficial level that, according to many, annulled the law of value. Footnote 1. Thus, Marx wrote to Engels in a letter dated 9 August 1862, quote, all I have to prove theoretically is the possibility of absolute rent without infringing the law of value. This is the point round which the theoretical controversy has revolved from the time of the physiocrats until the present day. Ricardo denies that possibility. I maintain it. I likewise maintain that his denial rests on a theoretically false dogma derived from Adam Smith, the supposed identity of cost prices and values of commodities, close quote. In this case, Marx is interested in defending the law of value because what matters is the labor objectified in value, living labor, the human being itself. It is a fundamental ethical question. Not even rent is an exception to the law of value, that everything that is surplus value, price, and profit is everything is ultimately founded on human living labor. His inalienable dignity is still the rule. Hence, it was important to derive rent from surplus value and to build the necessary categories to establish the mediations in order to explain this phenomenon. Absolute rent by itself would not deserve such an extended treatment because historically it can disappear when the organic composition of capital in agriculture is equal to that of non-agricultural industry. However, it is a good example, as Marx mentions in a letter to Engels dated 2 August 1862, to illustrate the theory of surplus value, which is the matter in question now from the perspective of competition and of monopoly. On the other hand, this is the beginning of the confrontation with Ricardo. Finally, with Smith, Marx had approached the whole problematic of reproduction from production at the material level in the relationship of capital to capital, capital dash capital. Rent, instead, is a third source of revenue. That is a capital dash revenue, capital revenue relationship. And thus, the production cost problematic is abandoned to advance to a more superficial level, namely the sphere of circulation of, that is, of average profit production cost. Now we shall go from the question of rent in Robertus and the Ricardian law to the question of the cost price, that is section 7.1 to 7.2, to the question of the cost price 7.3, to end with the problem of rent in Ricardo 7.4 and Smith, Marx's continuous interlocutors. Now, this is the central moment of all the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, thanks to Johann Robertus, the German Ricardian socialist whose 1851 text Marx confronts here, as well as thanks to Proudhon and his theory of money. Marx was able to build his theory of value. Now, the assiduous scholar in London can, in the middle of anguish and real misery, discover his theory of average profit and the price of production starting from rent. Subsection 7.1, formulation of a theory of rent through a critical confrontation with Robertus. As in the beginning of the Grundrisse, where he confronts Proudhon, Marx starts to warm up the machine with comings and goings without a fixed destiny. He then enters into the question of wages, using categories such as average wages and average price. In agriculture, wages would be lower than in industry, the same as Austria in relation to England. Here, Marx raises a deep question. It is not about discovering differential rent by the diverse fertility of the land, but by something deeper and based in labor. That doesn't deny the need to figure out diverse fertility, needless to say. Anyway, quote, quite apart from the variation in rent according to the fertility of the land, rent as such would already be possible. It could exist because the average wage of the average agricultural worker is below that of the industrial worker. Now, close quote, to speak of possibility is to look for the essence, the fundament of rent, just as relative surplus value could be understood from the increase of productive force of capital, and thus eluding the question of being as absolute surplus value non-paid labor in the same way. Marx had to define as absolute rent in its possibility, in general, rent as surplus value, that is non-paid labor, in order to discover subsequent differences of rent based on higher productivity and other natural characteristics of the land, that is differential rent, differential fertility, etc. Including capital improvements, for example. His first provisional solution is then the following, quote, here we have already have the possibility rent, since, in fact, the agricultural laborer's wage does not, the average wage does not equal the average wage, since the agricultural worker's wage does not equal the average wage. This is rent. This is rent would be feasible quite independent of the price of the product, which is equal to its value, close quote. For now, the argument is incomplete, but we can immediately see the effect that the reading of Robertus had on Marx, which suggested to him, although with mistakes, the solution of the problem accomplished here for the first time in his life. Quote, Mr. Robertus seems to think that competition brings about a normal profit or average profit. Now, Marx names this concept for the first time in his theoretical life and with consciousness of building a category. bracket, close quote. We enter then into another universe, another phenomenological level. We've left behind the 9 first notebooks and entered into the level of the future book 3 of Capital. Competition as the level of abstraction within which many of the essential categories of Marxist thought will be built for the first time. Competition was the second part of Marx's program in the treatment of capital in general. Footnote 4. Competition is the movement of the totality of capital within which prices are leveled, equalized, and so an average level is produced in all branches of production. Located, thanks to Robertus, at this exact level, Marx moves to a creative discourse that reminds us of that moment in Grundrisse that led him to the discovery of surplus value. Footnote 5. Marx has left behind the question of average wages with which he started and uses Robertus' suggestion that the price of commodity A rises above its value. Now, it does not matter if Marx rejects the argument of his compatriot. The truth is that he has found the problem well situated in the good phenomenological sense. For this reason, Robertus deserves a place in history, like Proudhon with the question of money. First of all, Marx rejects the idea that average price is equal to the value. The average profit in a particular sphere, therefore, also is equal to the general rate of profit, because average price might be different from value, and also average profit and surplus value. And the average rate of profit of a branch or sphere of production may not coincide with the average rate of profit of all branches. Now, all this is understood now from competition. That is, the ontological level of construction of the world of commodities. Quote, competition among capitals thus seeks to treat every capital, the Gesamtkapital, as a share of the total capital, and correspondingly to regulate its participation in surplus value and hence also in profit. Competition, plus ou moins, more or less, succeeds in this by means of its equalizations. Competition achieves this equalization by regulating average prices. These average prices themselves, however, are either above or below the value of the commodity, so that no commodity yields a higher rate of profit than any other. It is therefore wrong to say that competition among capitals brings about a general rate of profit by equalizing the price of commodities to their values. It's therefore wrong to say that competition among capitals brings about a general rate of profit by equalizing the price of commodities to their values. On the contrary, it does so by converting the values of the commodities into average prices in which a part of surplus value is transferred from one commodity to another, close quote. However, Marx imagines a sphere of production where there is an impediment to competition. And because of this reason, the average price, which in this case would be under its value, is not respected and increases until it is equal to the imminent value. This terminology of a Robertian influence is new in Marx. It shows a denominative indecision, a creative moment in Marx's categorical discourse. There could be 3 cases: one in which average price is superior to the imminent value, one in which it is inferior, and one in which it is equal. The case of absolute rent is analogous. The case of absolute rent is analogous to the second, in which its intrinsic surplus value is higher than the surplus value realized in its average price. Let us now retread let us now reread carefully the text placed at the beginning of this chapter 7. There are still two questions left to explain. Why is the value of the agricultural product greater than the industrial product? And how is it possible? How is it possible for the agricultural capitalist to realize the excess over the general average profit in order to recover all his surplus value without transferring it to other commodities or branches? See figure 7.1. Now, as for the first issue, Marx has now to prove the opposite of the way he started. If agricultural wages are lower but have the same organic composition, the product has less value, and then rent could be abstracted. Now, Marx contends that in agriculture there is a lower organic composition of capital, and therefore agricultural products have a higher value than industrial products produced under the same conditions, except for its organic composition. Quote, well, first, the figure 7.1, absolute rent is surplus profit realized over average profit. And so numbers 1, average profit, 2, etc., indicate hypothetical amounts of value, each with a purely pedagogical purpose. We have respected Marx's names for the time being without anticipating further precisions and without clarifying his ambiguity. So 1 is there, 2, surplus value, necessary labor, component part of value, production cost, necessary labor, and component part of value are equivalent to production costs. And then the average price is, if determined by the general average profit, is 5, and the imminent value of 6 is the same as it were, average price of the agricultural product, noting, of course, that this is contingent. One has to prove, Marx writes consciously, about a problem that has not yet been resolved, and that, of course, other people, try to ignore in some ways, that agriculture belongs to those particular spheres of production whose commodity values are above their average price. This point appears, footnote 8, certain to apply to agriculture on an average because manual labor is still relatively dominant in it and is characteristic of the bourgeois mode of production to develop manufacture more rapidly than agriculture. This is, however, a historical difference which can disappear, close quote. Now, Marx answers the second issue, stating that the private ownership of land, that is mines or water, by certain people, enables them to snatch, intercept, and seize the excess surplus value over and above profit, that is average profit. However, it is the farmer or agricultural capitalist who must accomplish the excess of their price over their production costs, and who imposes this price thanks to a suspension of competition by means of monopoly, founded, of course, on the private property of land. Quote, so the monopoly of land ownership enables the landed proprietor to squeeze that part of surplus labor from the capitalist, which would form a constant excess profit, but those who derive rent from monopoly are mistaken. Those who derive rent from monopoly are mistaken when they imagine that monopoly enables the landed proprietor to force the price of the commodity above its average price to sell the commodity not above, but at its value, close quote. The essential question was then to justify the existence of absolute rent. This is necessary because capital demands before itself the existence of the poor, namely to confront the laborer as someone else's property and make him into a wage laborer. Capital needs to snatch from peasants their traditional means of survival, and land is the basis for their subsistence. Quote, Its only requirement is that land should not be common property, that it should confront the working class as conditions of production, not that is not belonging to it. Close quote. For the industrial capitalist, the landlord is then an additional necessity as the enforcer of the non-possession by living labor of its means of subsistence. It is clear that the radical bourgeois would like to eliminate it and grant property of land to the state, but does not do so because it would be dangerous for the other form of property. Footnote 11. Now, this is a capitalistic way to justify absolute rent. As for differential rent, due to the diverse fertility of the land, Ricardo seemed to be right, but essentially wrong regarding its foundation. That is, quote, modified in this way, the proposition is correct. It explains the existence of rent, whereas Ricardo only explains the existence of differential rents, and actually does not credit the ownership of land with any economic effect. Footnote 12. Now, other issues discussed in the text can be read without any difficulty of interpretation. Marx indicates as a methodological suggestion that Robertus intuitively surmises that the difference between surplus value and its special forms, but in the question of rent, he misses the point because right from the beginning he is concerned with the explanation of a particular phenomenon, that is ground rent, and not with the establishment of a general law. Namely, intuition comes before concept. The forms of appearance are phenomena, but it is necessary to discover the essence, the general law, by some other form of manifestation. That is, absolute rent as phenomenon from surplus value, which is its essence in that sense. Subsection 7.2, methodological digression. Now, we wish to step ahead from Marx's own diachronic historical discourse in order to allow the reader of the manuscripts of 61 to 63 an accurate, precise, clear epistemological attention. Now, usually, no importance is given to the name, that is, the denomination of those categories. Remember, we looked at 8 categories. And this is a mistake made even by the editors of MEGA 2.3, who in the index to volume 7 sometimes mislead the readers with their references. Now, maybe the best example of this is the category whose concept or semantic content is the value expressed in the sum of production costs or cost price. That is, the component parts of the constant capital plus variable capital and average profit. In capital, it will be called price of production. Price of production. Footnote 13. Now, this is figure 7.2. You can see here market value 1, the connection 2, and how it kind of how it moves, as it were, 1, 2, 3. The cost price, which is 4, you can see the difference between, that is, that value is established, and that cost price relation to value sits at a kind of frontier to cost of production and price of production. So 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. Now, Marx hesitated, however. He was unsure for a long time about the names of his categories. This is not a terminological question, but a semantic problem. In fact, at the beginning, he has no conceptual clarity, namely, has not yet clearly separated the noetic content, and thus still has not decided what name to adopt for each moment of the concept, or precis, from precidere in Latin, to distinguish, cut, or sever category, or precise or precise category. When the final term or word names a clearly specified concept. Only at this moment a category is finally been constructed. In fact, price of production appears for the first time in Notebook 15, our chapter 10, explicitly separated from cost price, arrow 5 of figure 7.2. Profit, and therefore the difference between price of production and cost price appears to him as a surplus over the cost price only as regards his own commodity, close quote. Only at this moment is price of production distinguished precisely from production cost. Furthermore, names of new categories appear, such as market value, market price, in addition to the already analyzed average profit. The denomination production cost has been discussed from the beginning of these manuscripts. The passage that is arrow 4 to cost price is performed now only in Notebook 11, although its concept has been enunciated sometime before. Quote, here the average price, i.e. that formed by the production cost plus the average profit, production cost plus average profit, coincides with the market price of the product. Average price coincides with the market price of the product. Close quote. In light of such epistemological attention, we shall see the new categories which appear in these pages. Quote, in competition, there are two distinct movements towards equalization. Capitals within the same sphere of production equalize the prices of the commodities produced within this sphere to the same market price. The average market price value should equal the value of the commodity, were it not for the equalization between different spheres of production. As between these different spheres, competition equalizes the value to the average prices, insofar as the reciprocal interaction of the capitals is not hampered by a third element, and that is land ownership, close quote. As one can see, the new category market price, which appeared for the first time long before footnote 16, is slowly being distinguished from the much broader concept of average price. Footnote 17, at a more superficial level as a more concrete price, and within the same branch, is not yet clearly discovered the concept of market value, but a few pages later we see it differentiated. This, quote, this common value is the market value of these commodities, the value at which they appear on the market. Expressed in money, this market value is the market price. The actual market price is now above, now below this market value and coincides with it only by chance. It can be said that the average of the average market price is the market price which represents the market value, close quote. So then, the fundamental relation of market value with respect to market price, arrow 6 of figure 7.2, is one of many possibilities among these newly constructed categories. We have thus indicated only a few of these new categories in order to assist with the reading. Let us now return to our commentary, as if we weren't further confused, I suppose. Subsection 7.3, the Ricardian law of rent and its history. Marx starts by confronting James Anderson's theory, especially in his work, Essays Relating to Agricultural and Rural Affairs, 1775 to 96, but also considers other works regarding the corn crisis. our philosopher and economist comments, quote, now, with a correct conception of rent, the first point to arise was, of course, that it does not originate from the land, but from the product of agriculture, that is, from labor, from the price of the product of labor, from the value of the agricultural product, from the labor applied to the land, not from the land. Marx, close quote. Marx says that now what Anderson calls the value of the whole produce is evidently nothing more than his conception of the market price at which the product is sold. And he concludes, quote, with Anderson, rent equals the excess of the market price of the product over its average price. Rent equals the excess of the market price of the product over its average price. In one of his terms, that is market price, Marx already has more clarity than in his initial descriptions. So see in section 7.1 concepts such as imminent value in relation to average price. However, there is still an ambiguous average price, which later on shall be price of production. Now, if Marx has a positive judgment of Anderson, in contrast, he is too negative, too harsh towards Malthus, Thomas Robert Malthus, in this case toward his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Progress of Rent of 1815. Marx compared Malthus to Ricardo, who, according to Marx, was serious, scientific, and honest, in a famous epistemological passage, quote, when a man seeks to accommodate science to a viewpoint which is derived not from science itself, however erroneous it may be, but from outside, from alien, external interests, then I call him base, close quote. There are 4 excellent pages, 346 to 50, which show his disgust with Malthus and with his great respect for Ricardo. A confrontation with Wilhelm Roscher, 1858, allows Marx to raise the point that in many cases theories are appearances which an interest struggle hides under their surface. Marx is very much aware of the identification of a scholar with a class faction, Malthus or Roscher with the landlord's oligarchy, Ricardo with industrial capitalism. If he had to choose, Marx would favor the latter. Once again, Marx criticizes Robertus and shows that, in fact, he has not understood Ricardo. The latter thus defined rent. Ricardo defines rent, quote, rent is that portion of the produce of the earth which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. When, in the progress of society, land of the second degree of fertility is taken into cultivation, rent immediately commences on that of the first quality, and the amount of that rent will depend on the differences in the quality of these 2 portions of land. Close quote. And Marx objects, quote, Ricardo abstracts from the question of absolute rent, which he denies on theoretical grounds, because he starts out from the false assumption that if the value of commodities is determined by labor time, the average prices of commodity must equal their values, which is why he comes to the wrong practical conclusion that if values of commodities and average prices of commodities were identical, then absolute rent, etc. If, on the other hand, one knows that average prices and values are not identical, that the average price of a commodity may be either equal to its value or greater or less than, then the question, the problem itself, disappears, and with it also the hypotheses for its solution, close quote. average price, quote unquote, is here what he later calls price of production, and for the time being, cost price, if it includes average profit. But it could also be market price if it includes rent. That's a little complicated there. So average price is here what he calls price of production, and for the time being, cost price. But it can also be market price if it includes rent. Thus, it is an ambiguous concept which shows Marx elaborating or constructing historically, genetically, progressively. So when a few pages later, he once again criticizes the German pre-industrial Pomeranian, that is Robertus, who is not able to understand Smith or Ricardo because Ricardo's whole conception is only appropriate to the presupposition that the capitalist mode of production is the predominant one. We have to understand Rocher's position when he writes that nature as such has value. This is the whole issue of the value of land. Now let us skip a few pages and examine a recondite mystery from Notebook 15. Quote, the form of revenue and the sources of revenue are the most fetishistic expression of the relations of capitalist production. It is their form of existence as it appears on the surface, divorced from the hidden connections and the intermediate connecting links. Thus, the land becomes the source of rent, capital the source of profit, and labor the source of wages. Truly a recondite mystery. Anyway, close quote. In this formula, in which, quote, in this formula, in which rent, a part of surplus value, is represented in relation to a particular natural element independent of human labor, not only the nature of surplus value is completely obliterated because the nature of value itself is obliterated, but just as the source of rent appears to be land, so now profit appears to be due to capital as a particular material instrument of production, close quote. Now, Marx's reflection on this fetishization had already started in 1844 and is also found in the Grundrisse in Notebook 11. We read, quote, by original powers of the land, we understand here those which it possesses independently of the action of human identity, although, on the other hand, the powers given to it by human industry become just as much its original powers as those given to it by the process of nature, close quote. In Notebook 14, we find the best definition of the subject before the book Capital. The quote, the value of land is nothing but the price which is paid for capitalized rent, close quote. In other words, land per se, like human labor per se, for other reasons, has no value. But when it has been acquired or subsumed by capital as the non-property of living labor, it receives a rent. As a future payment of a rent, namely of a portion of surplus value distributed in the price of the product over and above production costs plus average profit, that is, an exchange value is granted to it, which we could call extrinsic or fictitious. So, as a future payment of a rent, namely of a portion of surplus value distributed in the price of the product over and above the production cost plus average profit, that is, an exchange value is granted to it, which we could call extrinsic or fictitious. If there were no rent, as in the case of fixed capital, then the value invested in the purchase of land would pass like other portions, aliquot parts to the value of the product. And this would be so not because land has a value, but because the land has been purchased with objectified labor, that is, money. labor capacity, and the exclusivity on the ownership of the land are paid because it is a reservoir containing the use values which are to be got hold of through industry. Now, such a payment can be recovered either in rent or the component portion of corresponding value, see figure 5.2, where the constant capital originally invested is reproduced in the product. So, in these pages, Marx approaches three more issues. That is, the average price of wheat during a certain historical period, the difference between absolute rent and differential rent in Thomas Hopkins in his 1825 book, who deserved a special study due to his social position, and the costs of breaking up new ground of soil, which become comprehensible after what has been commented. 7.subsection 7.4, cost price in Ricardo and Smith. Now, before focusing on this problem, let us make several methodological remarks. Marx points out, quote, Ricardo's method is as follows. He begins with a determination of the magnitude of the value of the commodity by labor time, and then examines whether the other economic relations contradict this determination of value or to what extent they modify it. This inadequacy not only shows itself in the method of presentation in a formal sense, but leads to erroneous results because it omits some essential links and directly seeks to prove the congruity of the economic categories with one another, close quote. Quote, one can thus see that through Ricardo one can thus see that though Ricardo is accused of being too abstract, one would be justified in accusing him of the opposite, that is, lack of the power of abstraction, inability when dealing with the values of commodities to forget profits, a fact which confronts him as a result of competition. Thus, Marx criticizes classical economists for not having constructed all the required categories in order not to pass directly from value to market price or from value to cost price, which are always identified. But this mistake is ideologically founded. Quote, since Smith transports himself right into the midst of competition, he immediately reasons and argues with a peculiar logic of the capitalist caught up in this sphere, close quote. So, from the bourgeois perspective, as he had written before, from the sphere of production, of circulation, from the bourgeois perspective, as he had written before, from the sphere of circulation, or the totality of capitalist understanding, from the everyday experience of the agent of capitalistic production, things appear to and are thought of by the latter as they influence him in practice. From the naiveties of the common sense of dominant system, its mistakes and confusions are ideologically necessary. Its rationality is coherent, and thus its implications are apparently methodological. Due to these logical and existential limitations, namely for being a capitalist, Ricardo makes mistakes or confusions which, setting aside the first four mentioned by Marx regarding rent, footnote 19, are as follows. That is, insufficient form of determining value, confusion between absolute and relative surplus value, identification of constant capital with fixed capital, and variable capital with circulating capital, and confusion between cost price with value, which is a mistake in considering the process of forming market value and cost price. Smith, on the other hand, confuses value with cost price. For Smith, the former value is constituted from the sources of revenue, from competition, and not from labor from production. We must point out that Marx's critique is systematic. In the case of Ricardo, it is global, and Marx analyzes in detail the most relevant passages of Ricardo's principles of political economy and taxation. In the case of Smith, he does the same with Origins of the Wealth of Nations from chapter 6 to 11 in Notebook 1. Since we cannot stop to comment on each item, although it should be done, we shall discuss only a few essential points to help the reader read Marx's text directly. So note here 7.3, the formation process of categories. Note that we saw categories in the prior chapters and the necessary variations among categories. So competition among branches in terms of deriving the general rate of profit as opposed to competition within a branch, and the beginning point, which is the general average social labor time. Against the mercantilists, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx assert that profit is not obtained by selling commodities above their value, as the physiocrats believe. Commodities are sold at their value, at a first level of abstraction of capital in general, as in the Grundrisse, Marx affirmed the same. Now, on the contrary, and hereafter we shall speak at the level of denominations, that is, names, concepts and categories, just as they are written in this Notebook 11. Now, Marx will say that average prices and values are not identical, but the average price of a commodity can be equal, higher, or lower than its value. In other words, he affirmed that the value of a commodity VC, or the natural price of the classics, is not equivalent to the cost price CP. But in addition, the latter is also not equal to the market price, see figure 7.3. All these apparent contradictions are necessary to demonstrate how surplus value is distributed among the various moments, of the process, until the market price of the individual commodity is concretely determined as a result of supply and demand, an aspect which Marx does not discuss here because it was to be the object of special treatment in the book on competition in the concrete, as the second book after the book on capital in general. Now, if you can maintain a sense of all of those things, right? Cost, price, variable cost, average price, market value, market price. So there's differences among these things, and of course some which come because of competition within a branch as opposed to competition among branches. So noting here that cost price is this, we could, we should look into this further, but cost price as a proxy for, or an index of marginal price in that sense. Although I'm curious whether anyone really pursued it in that kind of definitional way or theoretical way. First, back to the text. First, the determination of value is always by LT, labor time. On this point, Ricardo is correct, but he is mistaken because he cannot formally define this determination by the social nature of labor. Quote, Marx does not examine the form, the peculiar character of labor, close quote. On the other hand, Marx discovers that the determination of market value, MV, is made from the total mass of socially determined labor of a particular sphere of production. Thus, quote, thus competition brings it about here that the value of each individual commodity in a particular sphere of production is determined by the total mass of social labor time required by the total mass of the commodities of this particular sphere of social production, close quote. In this case, the value of commodities is determined from the total mass of social labor compared with the total mass of commodities in this particular sphere of production, the micro versus macro, and not directly by the individual labor time. Second, Marx makes the passage from the value of a commodity to its cost price, VC to CP, explaining the function of competition in general. In fact, the transformation of the value of commodities into cost price is achieved by determining the average profit, AP, leveled by competition. So, the category of AP, average profit, is the required mediation to pass from value to cost price. Furthermore, the foregoing allows Marx to assert, on the one hand, that the totality of surplus value is identical as mass to profit, but on the other hand, in a certain historical moment, for example, is the average rate of profit in a peripheral country a world average or a national average? So, in a certain historical moment, it can be higher with extraordinary profit, equal or lower with surplus value transference than the average profit. So, capital export, in the imperial age, for example. This allows Marx to explain the transfer of surplus value, that is VC to CP, and it allows us later to propose some hypothesis on the dependency issue, VC to CP, that is the transfer of surplus value to the center, if VC is the value of commodities of a underdeveloped peripheral country. So values of commodity shift in terms of price, and in fact, we could argue that relative to, for example, a supply chain or some other version of perhaps transaction costs. Anyway, third, Marx passes from cost price to market price, as we've seen in this case, and due to the mediation of the category of market value, competition does not level the average profit individually, but determines the value of commodities from its whole aggregate, that is the total mass, the total amount, compared with the total mass of social labor in the specific branch of production. Quote, competition creates the market value, that is the same value for commodities of the same sphere of production, quote, quote. Now, under these circumstances, when the cost price is lower than the market price of the agricultural product, CP is less than MV, the latter, that is, achieve a market price which includes rent, where MP is greater than CP, and thus MV equals MP equals CP plus rent. Marx thus manages to affirm that the agricultural product is sold at its value, MV, market value equals market price, MV equals MP, and that, however, due to the low organic composition of agricultural production, its market value is greater than the average, general average price or cost price. MV is greater than CP, and because the market value of the agricultural product is above the general cost price, this is what makes absolute rent possible as extraordinary profit. That is, absolute rent is the difference, is MV, market value, minus cost price. Likewise, in this case, one could think of a peripheral market value of underdeveloped country analogous to a particular production sphere and also show how the transfer of surplus value is possible because its particular market price is greater than the international cost price. We believe that with these reflections, we have constructed a minimal theoretical framework to be able to read now Marx's critical confrontation with Ricardo and Smith. Now, we're almost to the end, and I will go over time just a slight bit. Now, it's a little hard rolling here, but I hope you can read along with this. We shall exclude from this section pages 470 to 521, the end of notebook 11 and beginning of 12 about the differential rent tables, which we shall explain in section 7.6. Concerning its content, Marx analyzes here the question of rent in both classics. For the sake of our reading, it must be emphasized that this is one of the best methodological examples, or the place where we can discover the epistemological status of these 10 notebooks. Now, here we can see that they're not a history, because if this were the case, they should describe each author's position, and this is not done systematically. Neither are they a theory of surplus value, because as we shall see, this issue is hardly ever mentioned, although there is always an indirect relation. They are, in fact, a critical confrontation with the theories of Marx's opponents. Furthermore, the purpose of this critical confrontation is not to exercise only certain initial hypotheses, but in the confrontational critical process, Marx keeps discovering and building new categories, keeps developing concepts, and thus they become more complex, profound, different hypotheses. Thus, there is progress, not only in the analysis, but in the starting point as well, in the framework or hypothetical categorical system from which the critical confrontation is performed. As we have seen in previous sections, Marx now has new categories. Now it's time to use them. In other words, he has new questions. Marx's theoretical production is appearing genetically in the confrontational critical progressive process. Now, the best example of the foregoing is the case of the very important category, the concept which comprehends the sum of production costs plus average profit. Until this moment, he had named it cost price, but in a dense page against Smith, Marx writes, quote, "The sufficient price is that price which is required for the commodity to appear on the market, and therefore to be produced. Thus, it is the price of production of the commodity. For the price which is required for the supply of the commodity, the price which is required for it to come into existence at all, to appear as a commodity on the market, is, of course, its price of production or cost price. That is the sine qua non of the existence, the Dasein of commodity." Yeah, it is particularly dense. Quote, or close quote. Here we see doubt, a hesitancy in the denomination, the naming process. A few lines below, Marx once again names the same concept with the two denominations, as we've already quoted in section 7.2. But later on, he forgets the name price of production, which will only appear again in notebook 15. Namely, Marx keeps changing conceptualization and denomination. Both processes are not simultaneous, but form part of the progress in the constitution of a category. Now, this critical confrontation against Ricardo and Smith is carried out from a fundamental hypothesis. Quote, The whole blunder originates in the confusion of cost price with value, close quote. Evidently, confusing both concepts leads to other mistakes, which are their corollary. Cost price can no longer be lower than market price. The value of commodity cannot be equal to market price. When equalizing the value of commodity with cost price, VC equals CP or CP equals MP, there is no possibility for absolute rent, which arises from their inequality. That is, VC or MP greater than CP. We can see why absolute price can be set to zero for some folks. Marx's rich pages, of which we shall only describe the relevant lines, can be fully understood from this simple categorical perspective. Now, first of all, Marx shows that Ricardo falls into an insoluble contradiction. He is either to deny that the determination of value is made from labor time or deny absolute rent. In order to sustain the first against Smith, he eliminates absolute rent, but falls, on the other hand, into a new contradiction. When he gives a value to the land or mines and not dynamis in potency, with which he destroys the law of value he intended to defend. In these pages, 457 to 70, it is first demonstrated that England, unlike Germany, is in this respect the most revolutionary country in the world, namely the capitalist country that has discovered how to base all exploitation from capital, taking as a rational starting point the occupation of land without prior ownership, footnote 20, in the colonies, and transferring this to the course of world history. They took the capitalist mode of production as a prius for agriculture in general. The English people do not have to struggle as much as the peoples of the continent against traditional relationships that hinder the modern property of land, since there is an abundance of capital, and because Ricardo does not distinguish property from monopoly, he only discovers differential rent. On the worst land, and presupposing that value is equal to cost price, VC equals CP, no rent would be paid. While on the best land, when the value of product is lower, there would be a place for rent. VC is less than CP, which equals to VC plus differential rent. Marx, on the other hand, explains this fact in a different way. All commodities, quote, all commodities whose value, in accordance with this organic composition, is above the cost price, thereby show that the labor expended on them is relatively less productive, close quote. Now then, to Marx, as we have seen, the value of agricultural product is greater than the cost price. VC is greater than CP. With that, he could also explain absolute rent. Indeed, when equalizing value with cost price, VC equals CP, Ricardo cannot obtain absolute rent except by adding a value over the producer's value. The product would sell above its value, which is the same as to suppose that the value of commodity, therefore, would not be determined by the quantity of labor contained in it. That is, the different organic composition of agricultural capital as a special sphere makes absolute rent possible, and the different fertilities of the land make possible differential rent. Competition cannot level the agricultural market price because the landlords own a monopoly of the land, a fact that Ricardo forgot to include in his reflection. All this has already been clarified in section 7.1 and the no value of land in 7.3, now discussed by Marx on 465 to 9. Now, When reconsidering the matter, Marx shows again that Ricardo has forgotten property as a fundamental determinant of rent. In order for rent to exist, the land has to be limited as the Hegelian entity, footnote 22, appropriated with a determinate degree of fertility, although absolute fertility cannot be missed, on which absolute rent depends, and of location in space. That is, that the question of a far away, more distant area is again a suggestion for the dependency question. Now, Ricardo is correct that differential rent does not increase the price of wheat, for example, because the agricultural market price as a global sphere of production is equalized by competition, and the different differential rents absorb the excess of the lands with the greater productivity or lower value of their products. But Ricardo makes a mistake because absolute rent by itself increases the market price, because without absolute rent, the market price would be less. That is, MP equals C lowercase c plus W plus P prime plus rent is greater than CP. Footnote 25. If no rent were paid, the price would be equal to the cost price. Therefore, absolute rent increases the market price. Now, another confusion consists in identifying natural price with market value. Naturally, the natural price is the cost price. By the same token, and returning to the question of the organic composition, Marx shows that Ricardo is correct about the causality in case D, as in dog, when only the constant capital falls. The variable capital remains the same. Marx concludes that, at any rate, within agriculture, its products have a higher value than its cost price because the composition of the capital employed on it is lower than the average composition of the capital employed in non-agricultural industry. In the case of the absolute rent, that is. In the case of the differential rent, competition within the special sphere of agriculture equalizes the market price. As fertility increases, the rent rises. As the fertility declines, rent is reduced. With absolute rent, the gap between the product's real or individual value and the market price increases. Marx begins then to develop a new concept that is individual value. For example, see the tables on 536. See figure 7.4. So Marx had already written, and you can hopefully see how differential rent operates sort of above and beyond. So CP is a sense, gives you a sense of the relation between cost of production and market price. So there's CP. The V1 is the indirect value on the best land, right? V3 is the individual value on the worst land. MV equals market value. That's this thing here. MP equals market price. X equals differential rent. Y equals absolute rent. R equals total rent, that is rent of X plus Y. And Z equals negative differential rent. So now, whether that fully explains differential rent, we leave it to others, but you can sort of see what's going on here. If the market value is less than the individual value, that is V3 of figure 7.4, but greater than the cost price, the differential rent is a negative quantity, so hence Z. Hence, the total rent equals the absolute rent plus the negative differential rent, i.e., minus the excess of the individual value over the market value, close quote. After what we have discussed, There are not many novelties in Marx's critique of Smith, although methodologically we can indicate that now Marx is found categorically with more equipment than in the previous critical confrontation of our chapter 5. Smith decomposed the commodity value into wages, profit, and rent, leaving aside the constant capital. But Smith quickly lets himself be persuaded by the contrary view, which identifies value and natural price, that is, the average price or cost price, determining the second by the sum of wages, profit, and rent. The reading's difficulty is being able to compare Smith's nomenclature with Marx's, and some are proverbial in this sense. Simplifying, we can say that Marx criticizes Smith for lack of precision in the use of categories, his ambiguity, but also a semantic slip, the concept's change of content. Smith's natural price would be approximately Marx's market price when including rent. The sufficient price would be approximately the cost price or the price of production, named here explicitly the ordinary price, something that fluctuates in its content. So Smith is correct when he says that rent is monopoly price, since it's only the intervention of landed property which enables the product to be sold for more than the cost price, to be sold at its value. But actually, Smith does not know that the agricultural product sells for its value. He believes the opposite. Quote, to Smith, rent rises from the demand being greater than the supply at the sufficient price, which only includes wages and profit, but no rent. Adam Smith's mistake is that he fails to recognize that landed property sells above the sufficient price. It sells them, if it sells them, at their value. Close quote. Marx exclaims when evaluating his critical confrontation, quote, in this fantastic fashion, the profoundest concepts intermingle with the craziest notions, such as the common mind forms in an abstract manner from the phenomenon of competition, close quote. Subsection 7.6, the rent tables. First of all, let us make a short methodological reflection about the diagrams or tables that Marx sketched in his studies and that have led to false interpretations. All the polemics between Bulgakov, Tugan-Baranovsky, and Lenin, to which we must add Bukharin, Rosa Luxemburg, Kautsky, Grossman, or Bauer, and Otto Bauer, who also circle around this question. Marx explains, and now for consideration of the tables, they show how the general law explains a great multiplicity of combinations, while Ricardo, because he had a false conception of the general law of rent, perceived only one side of differential rent and therefore wanted to reduce the great multiplicity of phenomena to one single case by means of forcible abstraction. The tables are not intended to show all the combinations, but only those which are most important, particularly for our specific purpose, close quote. In other words, the comparative tables of diverse logical possibilities and components of the phenomenon under study do not have as a goal a complete description of the phenomena's reality, but only to observe the behavior of some component parts. Its intention is logical, pedagogical, structural, expositive, abstract, and not concrete. To this respect, Rosa Luxemburg is correct that the question of reproduction or accumulation and their corresponding tables have nothing to do with mathematical formulas that express objective reality and can be perfectly presented and comprehended without the need of them. When Marx employs mathematical tables, he does so simply to facilitate and to clarify the main points of the analysis, footnote 24. Now, if we take Marx's tables abstractions as real and concrete considerations, and not in reference to our specific purpose, one could arrive at completely wild conclusions. The tables are always situated at a general level, abstract, essential, while the concrete analysis is situated in the complex contour of capital in its historical reality. The tables express essential relationships, abstract. Quote, in considering the essential relations of the capitalist production, therefore, it can be assumed that since this tends to occur more and more, is the principal purpose, and the productive powers of labor are developed to the highest point, in this case alone, that the whole world of commodities, all the spheres of material production, the production of material wealth, have been subjected either formally or really to the capitalist mode of production, close quote. Now, this assumption or supposition is the analytical moment of abstraction, in existence as such as abstract in reality, but really existent as an aspect of reality. This supposition is considered in the reproduction tables of the Grundrisse, or in the manuscripts of 61-63, and also in Capital, Volume 2, Part 3, Chapter 21, footnote 25. Now, going deeper into our commentary, it's necessary to comprehend the difference between total amount of rent and rental rate. The total amount can increase, but not the rate. The rate can rise or decrease, and not the total amount. The rate is a proportion between the commodity value and the cost price. Quote, the rate of rent would fall because the difference between the cost price and the value of the quantity would have decreased. The relationship between value and cost price is the only relationship that determines the rate of rent, close quote. Marx then proposes some logical abstract examples from A to E, in which the factors that could cause a change in absolute or differential rent will vary. These factors are, quote, capital, total value, total product, market value per ton, individual value, differential value, cost price, absolute rent in tons, differential rent in tons, total rent, and then the totals of all classes in each table, unquote. In a second group of tables, while trying to discover the logic of the relation between the organic composition and rent, Marx had to introduce new factors. That is, yes, constant capital, variable capital, surplus value, the rate of profit, and the rate of surplus value. Quote, here the rate of rent rose because the rate of profit fell. Now, did it fall because there was a change in the organic composition of the capital? Unquote. Now, to follow Marx's discussion step by step would take too long and not be very useful, because after the explanations given above, the reading is now possible. We will only indicate the main lines of discussion. First of all, the construction itself of the tables with their various factors is explained. Second, there is an interesting discussion of the question about how the price of each commodity is determined and the surplus value contained in it. Third, the relationship between the individual value, the cost price, and the market value of commodities is explained, including a possible example of an individual value greater than its market price, as we have seen. If above the market, quote, if above the market price, the difference between the market value and the cost price, that is alpha of figure 7.4, is smaller than the difference between their individual value V3 and their cost price, but as the absolute rent equals the difference between their individual value and their cost price, the market value cannot, in this case, yield the entire absolute rent for these products, close quote. In fourth place, the possibility of a decreasing productivity of agriculture is discussed against Ricardo. Next, the variations in the rate of rent are analyzed in relation to the organic composition already discussed here. Finally, the variation of the relation between total rent and market value is discussed. There is a list of precise definitions and possible relations among them already referred to herein. So you see, quote, the actual rent is equal to the difference between market value and cost price. The absolute rent equals the difference between the individual value and the cost price. The differential rent equals the difference between market value and individual value. The actual or total rent equals the absolute rent plus the differential rent. This allows Marx to formulate some very clear equations. I won't read them out because it just gets really complicated, but suffice to say, we have relations among absolute rent, differential rent, the total rent, the market value, the individual value, and the cost price CP. So you have equations. These are Marx's equations. And after these fundamental equations, Marx analyzes several possibilities not discussed here, since they're easy to decipher. Yeah, sure. In this way, Marx has concluded a central moment of these manuscripts of 61 to 63, maybe the most important creative moment, and all since the moment in which, when criticizing Robertus, he discovered the meaning of average profit upon which he could build the category cost price without complete clarity yet on the price of production and market price, footnote 26. When we got to the end, I went over time. I apologize. We've been looking at Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, chapter 7 on rent. And I hope it made a little bit more sense the second time around. I will return to the meeting